Well, this morning we're going to pick up from where we left off last week. In Exodus, we began our new series in the book of Exodus last Sunday. And today we're going to begin right at the end of chapter 1, verse 22. And we're going to be reading to chapter 2, verse 10. Just 11 verses this morning. You'll be pleased to hear. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it in tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" "Yes, go," she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." This is God's word. Well, last week I went for a round of golf with my good buddy Jason up at Casa de Campo. The less said about the golf, the better, to be honest. Jason confirmed his status as the least worst of the two of us right at the death at the last hole. Anyway, Jason and I were hungry after all these exertions, and so we swung by Las Brisas on our way home for a quick bite to eat. And it was good, after all the turmoil of the golf, to just sit down and catch up on each other's news, not least our recent travels to our home countries, how things have been here at Trinity too. It seems to have been a really encouraging season for the faithful remnant here in Santa Cruz. And among other things, Jason mentioned just in passing that Julio, who's just arrived, and he's been coming to church with his family the last few months, that he owns a tire business near Chiringuano Market. I didn't know that before. Anyway, Jason and I headed home, and that was that. That was Tuesday afternoon. On Wednesday, I was driving through the back streets behind Kilometre 6 Market when I absent-mindedly hit a piece of loose curb that was lying on the road. It turned out it was an especially jagged chunk of curb, and it tore a huge, unfixable hole in my tyre. Actually, this was the first broken tyre that I had experienced in 2.5 years, of all times. So who did I call? Hermano Julio, of course. And not only was I able to get home that day, but I was also able to bless a brother in the process. And all because of an offhand comment at the end of a rubbish day's golf. Well, God works in mysterious ways, his wonders to perform. When we take a step back and when we analyse the details of our everyday lives, that is what's happening time and again. In all things, good, bad, and ugly, God is working for the good of those who love him. That's what we saw in chapter 1 of Exodus. God blessing his people by multiplying them and enabling them to live out their creation mandate, even in the face of outright opposition to him. And encouragingly, they thrived even after the passing of Joseph's generation. Miraculously, they kept growing even as they were enslaved. And delightfully, God blessed those who blessed his people in the case of the midwives. Indeed, as these opening chapters show us, in his mission to wipe out Israel's sons, Pharaoh overlooked a not insignificant obstacle: the daughters. What is God doing, even while he is seemingly silent? Well, that's the question that this famous book of Exodus wants us continually to be asking, as the whole purpose of the Exodus is for Yahweh to make himself known. And in the case of today's passage, which is one that I think most of us will know so well, it turns out that not only is he saving a baby, but he is laying some core gospel foundations. Firstly, in this passage, the weak shame the strong. Last week, we saw Pharaoh issue 2 separate mandates in an effort to curb the Hebrew population boom. And both of them failed. Actually, both were counterproductive. The people just kept on growing. But what Pharaoh orders in the closing verse of chapter 1 really takes things up a notch. And likely this sadly did result in a great number of infanticides. This new order says that every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile. And this order, unlike the previous ones, is not for a select group of people who are responsible for executing it, but rather this is for all his people. The difference now is that ordinary Egyptians are free to take this appalling law into their own hands without fear of any prosecution. Not unlike perhaps conditions for Jews in Nazi Germany, who we know often suffered terribly at the hands of their neighbours and townsfolk. But Pharaoh, in his benevolence, decrees that every girl may live. For Pharaoh, the leader of a great military power, it is boys who will grow up to be men who pose the real threat, not girls or women. And yet, who is the true threat to Egypt in these verses? It's the girls and the women. Moses' parents, who elsewhere are named as Amram and Jochebed, they marry and a son is born to them. And you know what? That is the last we hear of Amram. From here on, it's all Jochebed and her daughter Miriam. There's nothing here either about Moses' brother Aaron. And just put yourselves in Jochebed's shoes for a moment. In her sandals, you might say even. Giving birth to that beautiful, precious baby boy. And knowing that at any moment, he could be taken from you. You can imagine the family just continually on edge, always looking over their shoulder, on standby for the baby's cries so that he can be fed before anyone outside can hear him. And eventually Jochebed decides that she must abide by the letter of the law, if not the spirit of it. She will cast her son into the Nile, albeit in a basket which she makes. Just imagine her there diligently fashioning that basket in one corner of the family home, maybe by candlelight, occasionally looking over her shoulder at that beautiful baby boy, lying there peacefully, blissfully unaware of the horror that surrounds him. What pain of separation awaits. She must set him free because she loves him, as that old saying goes. Only even she knows that this is no guarantee of anything. She's just giving him a chance, and a very small chance, it would seem, of survival. So into the Nile he goes, with her daughter Miriam looking on, standing by as her mother's eyes and ears on the ground. It's a dangerous job, to be sure. What bravery Miriam shows, not only by being there, but also in approaching the daughter of her people's great enemy in that way. And she's resourceful as well. She cleverly volunteers Jochebed as a wet nurse for him. And then we have, along with her female entourage, we have the key daughter in the whole operation, namely the daughter of none other than Pharaoh himself. Miraculously and mercifully, she's not inherited her father's genocidal genes. Where he is tyrannical, she is tender. Where he is a megalomaniac, she is maternal. The seeds of Egypt's downfall lie in this Pharaoh's disregarding the daughters. Now, if you read international news, you might be aware that the UK will soon have a new Prime Minister. The last Scottish Prime Minister was Gordon Brown, who even by Scottish standards was an exceptionally dour Edinburgh man. Anyway, he got the job from his colleague Tony Blair in the dying days of the last Labour government. And Gordon Brown's first and last general election as Prime Minister was in 2010. And while out campaigning, he was approached by an old lady who was a Labour supporter, but she had some questions for him about Labour's immigration policy. And Gordon Brown then got into his car, and forgetting that he had a lapel microphone attached to him, he proceeded to complain to his team about this, quote, bigoted woman who had just confronted him. And the media heard the whole exchange. And a week later, removal vans were seen outside 10 Downing Street. A wee old woman effectively brought down a government. Now that was newsworthy because that's not generally how things work in our world. But as Christians, we shouldn't be so surprised because that's how our God works. He is in the business of using not necessarily those who are weak, we should stress, but rather those who the world might perceive as weak, to shame those the world perceives as strong. See in the book of Genesis alone, see the way that God repeatedly favours the younger brother over the elder brother. Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Joseph and Judah over Reuben. That's just not how it was done. And it's going to be the same even here with Moses and Aaron. See how he chooses also the Jewish race, not because they were the largest of all peoples, or the greatest of all peoples, or the strongest of all peoples. They were none of these things. But simply because, as he later says in Deuteronomy, simply because he loved them. I think also, not only here but elsewhere in Scripture, how he uses women like Rahab, like Ruth, like Bathsheba, like Mary, to bring salvation to his people, and also women like Mary Magdalene and her friends to announce his salvation to his people. And above all, think of how he uses a crude Roman cross, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles, and a man of sorrows, despised and rejected by humanity. He uses all these things to save humanity and to disarm the rulers and authorities, making a public spectacle of them. So you know what? We can be at ease in our weakness and in our apparent ordinariness. In fact, I think that as Christians, we should be most comfortable of all people about this. I think this is what doesn't quite sit right with us maybe when we see perhaps churches prioritising their social media accounts or their buildings or their laser light shows on a Sunday morning above all else. No, we are called instead to the foolishness of preaching, to the quiet persistence of prayer, to the warmth of fellowship, to the happy humility of worship, to the steadiness of the sacraments, and to the benevolence of service. And it is here in all these things that we rest not on ourselves, but we rest on the God of the Exodus. We invite him to enter in and to build his church. We can do that on a corporate level, and we can do that on an individual level. We can rest, we can be confident in our seeming weakness, our seeming ordinariness. What an amazing truth that is. And a second notable feature of this passage is the unlikely ally. In Pharaoh's obsession with the boys, as we're already seeing, he overlooks the girls. And in his obsession with the populace, he's overlooking the palace. The biggest danger to Pharaoh in all these verses, remarkably, lies within his own family. From her nearby perch, Jochebed's daughter Miriam is grasping what's going on, and she, as this princess, peers into the basket. And thinking on her feet, she approaches Pharaoh's daughter, and she imaginatively offers one of the Hebrew women, as she says, as a wet nurse. Which woman does she fetch? Why, Jochebed herself, of course, and arrangements are made. And this encounter yields some remarkable outcomes in which a divine hand is so clearly seen. Think about this. Firstly, a Hebrew baby boy is spared. And that is miracle enough at this time of state-sponsored barbarity. More than this, Moses' mother effectively gets her baby back. And she's paid for the privilege. Parenthood is a task that brings abundant joy in itself. Nevertheless, she is handsomely rewarded for simply doing her motherly duty. Remarkable. And more than this, when this baby boy comes of age, he's going to go up to the palace and he will be raised as a member of the royal household. And so the boy, through whom Yahweh will one day bring down the house of Pharaoh, is raised in the house of Pharaoh. You could not make that up. Now, as we were praying, it's been a week of high international tensions. And in addition to the hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, there's been that saber rattling between the USA and China surrounding Speaker Pelosi's visit there to Taiwan. And in such days, it's important for us to hold on to our faith and see things from the perspective of the one enthroned in heaven. Think of the last century alone. So many people who have shaken their fist in his direction, just as Pharaoh did, and often in really terrifying fashion. They've risen and they've fallen. Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Tito, they all came and went, and so did their regimes. But God's plan remains firmly on course, because the nations are merely God's instruments. Even the great ones like Egypt, and yes, a great nation like Rome, who unwittingly enthroned King Jesus. They're just playing into God's hands. Really, it's all very unfair. They don't stand a chance. In troubling times like ours, I think we can draw no small comfort in seeing things from this eternal perspective. So we've seen two, what you might call gospel-y features in our text so far. And taking the passage as a whole, we find one more, and we'll dwell on this as we come into our time of communion. The rescued rescuer. And this was obviously a standout portion of Scripture for the Israelites. And that's reflected in the structure of this story. They say that there are 141 words in the Hebrew, and right in the middle of the story, with 70 words on either side, is the word child, or baby, as we have it here in verse 6 in the NIV. And clearly, taking a step back from all the amazing details in these verses, it is the preserving of Moses, the man that God will use to let his people go. That this is the big step forward in the Exodus narrative. And right at the end of this passage, Moses is named by Pharaoh's daughter. And it's another instance in Exodus of people doing more than they really understand. He's named Moses because, as she says, she drew him out of the water of the Nile. But remember, how is God going to save his people? How is he going to save those who he calls his firstborn son? He's going to do this by drawing Israel out of the water of the Red Sea. Interestingly, Miriam was a witness to that as well, wasn't she? Actually, there are more compelling parallels between the rescue of Moses and the rescue of Israel. Both are named That's to say, at Mount Sinai, Israel will be confirmed as God's treasured possession, a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. And like Moses, Israel enjoys a remarkable change of status from slavery to sonship. In fact, it's a royal sonship, isn't it? Now, could we extend these parallels still further, say, into the people of God in the New Testament? Why, yes, we could. Because we too have been delivered through waters, so to speak, in our baptism into Christ. Also, we too have received a new name. We, says Peter, are that same royal priesthood and holy nation. In fact, we are saints. That's the name that we are given time and again, amazingly, in the New Testament. We have been freed so that we may no longer be burdened by that yoke of slavery to sin. And yes, capping it all off, what is it that the Apostle John writes again? Remember, he says, "See what great love the Father has lavished on us, that we should be called children of God." And that is what we are. Wonder if you read in the news this week about that eminent French scientist. I think he's an astronomer of some kind. He posted an image to his Twitter feed of what he claimed to be the nearest known star to the sun, as photographed by NASA's new telescope. This was fiery, it was detailed, it was vibrant, and it was in fact a slice of Spanish chorizo. Nevertheless, thousands of people around the world were fooled, if Twitter was anything to go by. But there's nothing fake or outlandish about what God has done for his people. It is totally consistent with his character. Throughout history, he has shown himself to be a God who shames the strong through the weak, a God whose plan the world's worst schemes are actually helping to realise, a God who delivers us, who names us, who adopts us. My friend, the God of the universe has done this for you. You are his child. And he's proven his commitment to you by saving you. How can this fail to anchor you and to bring you true hope as a new week looms large? And how can this not stir you to tell others about this great rescue? And the rescue of this rescuer, Moses, it pointed to a greater rescuer. We're going to remember what he did for us in a few moments. But before that, let's sing now together as we prepare to take communion.